The time for empty talk is over. Now arrives the hour of action.
Donald Trump delivers a combative inaugural address laying out a dark vision of America and how he'll make it brighter. Anti-Trump demonstrators break windows and start fires in D.C., but they don't disrupt the inauguration. South Florida, meanwhile, has peaceful protests.
This is something that we can do to help our cause.
The Women's March on Washington draws a huge crowd and makes demands for human rights and women's rights. We'll take it all to the roundtable. Good morning. So glad you could join us. Glenna is in Washington. You will hear from her in just a minute. We have certainly entered a new era in American politics, the Trump era. The Trump presidency began with a bang, a bleak speech that sounded like the one that Mr. Trump gave at the convention. Its themes were populism, nationalism, and protectionism on trade.
Because today, we are not merely transferring power from one administration to another, or from one party to another, but we are transferring power from Washington, D.C., and giving it back to you, the people.
Local 10's Glenna Milberg is in Washington this morning. Glenna has been there for several days now, covering the inauguration and the Women's March that took place yesterday. Glenna, great to see you. Good morning. How are things there today?
Good morning, Michael. Hello, everyone. Well, they are as gray and cold as they've been for a couple of days, but what the aftermath here is pretty amazing. Everyone's still talking about this stunning display of force yesterday. The nationwide estimates, all of the Women's March counts across the country, 2.5 million people. 1.5 of them were here in Washington, D.C., on the Mall, throughout the streets, marching all under the general banner of women's rights. You know, President Donald Trump had said that he wants to be the president for all people. These are the men and women that he is going to have to convince of that. The Women's March on Washington drew a staggering crowd in number and diversity. Headliners like feminist icon Gloria Steinem and a 21st century civil rights march.
There were so many marches in the past that all of us have seen on, newsreels. And to make my own news today was a big draw for me.
The signs document residual effects of then-candidate Trump's comments about women's body parts.
It hurt all of us.
Yeah.
We feel like it demeaned us.
But the movement is about issues: equal pay in the workplace, choice and access in healthcare and education.
These issues on your sign are really people's issues, not just women's issues.
That's true, but they impact and affect women as well. And if we can do what it says on the sign, we can help everybody.
Mr. Trump is in a position that he could endorse us as women, equal pay, and say, yes, I agree.
These are issues important to women, to our families, to our pocketbooks. I think we've already seen some of the changes, and it hasn't even been 24 hours. So I think it's important to be here, to keep reminding, and we're going to keep reminding, and we're going to continue to be out here, and we're going to continue to, voice our concerns.
The president had no immediate response to this incredible display, both in Washington and across the country yesterday. But he did this morning, and he did it via tweet. So Donald Trump at about 7:30 this morning issued a series of tweets, but the first one was, watched the protests yesterday under the impression that we just had an election. Why didn't these people vote? Celebrities hurt the cause badly. That was one of 3 tweets this morning. Celebrities, especially people like Madonna, who launched some F-bombs yesterday, were criticized a bit. But back to the line, we just had an election. Why didn't these people vote? That's actually a very interesting question. In light of, we met a woman not 10 minutes ago with a crew of people walking by the White House. She actually is the former Secretary of State for West Virginia, it turned out. She was here with her daughter and some other women and friends for the march. And her conversation was, she just lost an election as an incumbent. Her conversation was this march was such a magical thing, but goes nowhere unless people register and actually go to vote. And Michael, that's the whole point of the march organizers, is that this doesn't become an event on one particular day, but becomes a movement to engage people to register, to vote. Here in Washington later this week, they're having seminars to actually teach women how to run for elective office and how to get involved in politics.
Well, I think that is the main question. How does this amazing turnout yesterday in Washington, Miami, LA, Chicago, all around the world there were these marches, how does it evolve? Where does it go next?
It's such a great question, especially in light of the fact that this march started as a post on Facebook. So the power of social media is probably one of those things that we have to talk about. But when you have an engaged electorate, engaged enough and some angry enough and feeling oppressed enough to come out and march, travel, spend money and effort to get to another city. There were people from around the country here as far away as Seattle that came to Washington. That's a moment where when you have the attention and engagement for people to use it, to take it and get involved. So it's a great question to see, will people become engaged enough from whatever motivation, whether they love what the president stands for and what he's doing and get engaged in that respect, or anger and fear as a fuel to get involved.
Right.
I had a conversation I might share with my daughter this morning. How do you get involved? It's as simple as having a phone call or an email to your senator or congressman or woman to voice your opinion on how to vote on an issue, or to voice your opinion on an issue, tell them what you want. And that's simple and as a first step. So this might be a very teachable moment for this country.
Well, indeed it may. I want to say that I personally know about 18 women from South Florida, ranging from lawyers to judges to businesswomen, who flew to Washington to take part in that march. And most of them made the point to me, I'm not going there to oppose Donald Trump, even if I didn't vote for him. I am there for women's issues. I'm there for reproductive rights and human rights and equal pay. Now, when you were in that crowd yesterday, did you feel, was it mainly an anti-Trump crowd, or was it a pro-women's issue crowd?
The short answer to that is it was a pro-women's issue crowd, hands down, no dispute. It sort of morphed into an anti-Trump sentiment only because the political atmosphere here of this city this weekend, less than 24 hours from the inauguration. So these were people clearly, by and large, who did not vote for Donald Trump. But remember, it's not the president alone who sets the course of law and civil rights and human rights. So the Congress now is a very conservative Congress, and Donald Trump is the headliner, but I think people are starting to realize that the Congress has a lot to do with the laws that are going to be put in place, or laws that might try to be repealed, having to do with reproductive rights, women's rights, civil rights, human rights, etc. And so Donald Trump, of course, is going to have Supreme Court nominations. That's huge when it comes to that. But yesterday, to your question, yesterday's movement was a message to a government from people who are very concerned about what's to come.
Well, we are all curious about what is to come. We're glad you're there. Thank you for some excellent reporting, you and Janine Stanwood, over the last several days, and we will see you back here in Miami in a few. All right, coming up, we're going to talk with two respected South Florida professors about the Trump inauguration and what it means to the country and to South Florida. You certainly watched the swearing-in ceremony on Friday and listened to President Trump's combative and feisty inaugural speech. Well, we want to talk about it now with two respected South Florida academics. Gregory Bush is an associate professor at the University of Miami. He specializes in modern American history with an emphasis on political history. And Dr. Eduardo Gamarra is a political science professor at FIU, and throughout his career, he has served as a consultant to several branches of the federal government, including the State Department. Gentlemen, great to have you come in. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Eduardo, if I could begin with you. Traditionally, presidents, after they are elected, presidents-elect, spend a couple of months working on reconciliation, bringing the country together, and then give a speech that sounds all those notes. Donald Trump sounded a few of those notes, but they were distant and in between other assertions.
Right. In fact, what I would say is that, if you look at the farewell address by President Obama and the speech, the inaugural speech, what you see is actually two people speaking about two entirely different countries.
Right.
And this reminds me more of kind of the inaugural addresses that I have seen elsewhere in our hemisphere by populist leaders in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Venezuela. The very same kind of theme. We're talking about two countries, and the country that they've left behind, for example, is usually a country that's fairly healthy.
Yeah. Well, does that make Donald Trump something of a caudillo?
Very much so, very much so. And if you look at not only the charisma, the relationship that he has with a very, very strong core following, which is akin to what Latin Americans often call, this is the nation. My followers are the nation, and those who don't follow me are the anti-nation. So these are core themes of populism throughout the globe.
Right. Greg Bush, the speech that we heard on Friday seemed to me entirely consistent with the campaign that Donald Trump ran. In fact, it reminded me of his acceptance speech of the nomination at the convention in Cleveland.
I agree. I don't think he's evolved that much from that time. In other words, I think he's using a lot of the same rhetoric. He goes back to, he didn't mention the wall in the same way in the inaugural address, thank goodness for him to some degree. But it's a lot of the same, I would argue, sense of everything revolving around himself, his own understanding of the world, which as far as I'm concerned is very limited. And I mean, I honestly was embarrassed to have him as our president. Listening to that, I've listened to many other inaugural addresses, and I think he's a major national embarrassment.
Well, I've certainly, in my lifetime, listened to every inaugural address, and generally, I think you find something to be inspired. I think part of the reason I've spent the last 50 years as a journalist was John F. Kennedy saying, ask not what what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I think that inspired a whole generation of people. I wonder, was there a line on Friday that will inspire people?
I think we may be looking at it from too much of a position of an intellectual position or even an analytical position, and not from
an emotional position.
Yeah. But when you talk to Trump followers, they were definitely inspired by the speech.
Yes, they were.
They think that it was the best speech ever given. Yeah. And again, this is what's so I find intriguing about this modern wave that we have in the world. It's not rational, it's not, but it is absolutely passionate.
Yeah, it is indeed. Well, the one I think most controversial to me anyway, and I think to most commentators, part of the speech was where he listed the terrible ills of America. This was a bleak dystopian speech. And then he talked about American carnage, and we want to play this soundbite from the speech for you. Listen, and listen carefully.
But for too many of our citizens, a different reality exists. Mothers and children trapped in poverty in our inner cities. Rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation. An education system flush with cash, but which leaves our young and beautiful students deprived of all knowledge. And the crime, and the gangs, and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. This American carnage stops right here and stops right now.
Well, that part of the speech was too much for even the Wall Street Journal editorial page. Yesterday, it published an editorial in which it said, quote, as he often does, Mr. Trump also made American life today seem much darker than it is, invoking this American carnage in one jarring passage. Subtlety is not the Trump style, and America has problems. But carnage is a word better suited for Aleppo under Russian bombing. Wow, Greg Bush, when the Wall Street Journal thinks that you've gone too far,
I think that is that's devastating. It is, but I think it's important to understand what makes Donald tick at one level. And as far as I know, he reads not just regular polls, but he, as the actor and producer of The Apprentice, read local demographics for years. And so he knows, in other words, phrases, he's honed them over literally 20 years, 30 years as a personality. So he comes through to a lot of people, his followers, as authentic, as a real personality, etc.
Right, tells it like it is.
Yeah, tells it like it is. Doesn't matter if they're lies. Doesn't matter, in other words, even if the tone is dark or disparaging of groups, as long as he comes through as this kind of macho character, you know, and I think that that's a horrible role model for younger people.
Yeah. Well, in his book, The Art of the Deal, he did use the phrase truthful hyperbole as his style, and I think we saw it during the campaign. I think we saw it on Friday.
No, absolutely. But I think there's also something that's quite important, and that is the role of social media, and you know, his Twitter style, which in fact, if you analyze the Twitter style that he has, it falls very much in line with the trolling behavior that people have on the web, which is largely made to provoke people, right? It's not, in fact, if you talk to people who understand trolling, they'll tell you trolling is not that we really believe what we say, but we do it to provoke people. Yeah. And I think that a lot of that is what, you know, characterizes Mr. Trump in all of his behavior, not only on Twitter.
It's also making the news cycle.
Right.
You know, it's all timed in some ways.
Well,
keep it going.
Also, tweeting often, as he does, and doesn't appear he's going to stop, is a way of making it's an end run around the media, which on Saturday, when he went to the CIA, he called journalists, I'm reading from today's New York Times, among the most dishonest human beings on earth. And for his followers who despise the media, this is great stuff. I mean, they like that.
Absolutely. No, that's exactly what I was saying at the beginning. It really motivates people. It gets people to think passionately about this, and they believe that whatever he tells them, as Professor Bush just said, even if it's a lie, his followers believe it's true.
Yeah. Right. Well, to follow up here, today's New York Times has a front page above the fold story. The headline says, "Slamming media, Trump advances two falsehoods." He's talking about his address to the CIA yesterday, and they are calling him out. So this conflict between, and then Sean Spicer, the press secretary, in the afternoon went crazy on the media and said you purposely distorted the size of the crowd. Greg Bush, it seems to me the president, the day after he is sworn in, does he not have better things to think about than the size of the crowd at the inauguration?
One would think so. One would think so, but I don't think the way his mind works. I mean, he's just in the moment. And he's in the tweet in the moment and the one-upmanship of today. I was going to add one other thing, too, and that is Trump is not a man who understands history much at all. He doesn't read books. He's a man whose major idols, and he knows something about, is Patton and MacArthur. And I think that there's a real danger in that if you don't have a longer view of what's going on and how things have changed and, frankly, the long-term struggle within American culture for rights and freedoms and whatnot. And he, to my mind, has very little clue of that, has very little interest in that, and I think that's very dangerous for our country.
I should put out, in fairness, that he has a degree from the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. So at one point in his life, his young life, he certainly did read books, but he has said over recent years, no, I really don't read books anymore.
Yeah, but you know, again, I think comparison is important. We said sort of the same things about presidents that came to office without high school degrees or as metallurgical workers and what have you, and who, in the end, you know, governed their countries and were reelected. And of course, you know, to me, what is comforting about what's happening in this country, though, is that there is a very distinct contrast. We have strong institutions still, which will mitigate populism.
At the end of this program, I'm going to deliver a little commentary in which I say, Eduardo, you're prescient. That's exactly what I think too. And I also would point out that, yes, Harry Truman was a haberdasher in Kansas City, and boy, he turned out to be a good president.
He read history, for one thing.
Well,
he had a good sense of perspective.
And he had a great Jewish partner, which led him to recognize Israel before anybody else, and other things as well. Well, Eduardo Gamarra, great to have you come in.
Thank
Greg
you very
Bush,
much.
To see you.
thank you. All right, after the break, we're going to take all this and more to the Powerhouse Roundtable. Well, the inauguration, the feud with the media, the possible deportation of dreamers, and so on. We have got a lot to talk about this morning with our Powerhouse Roundtable, and we have a good one. H.T. Smith is an attorney, civil rights leader, and law professor at Florida International University, as well as a Roundtable regular. Rafael Yanez of Miami is a Republican activist and a political analyst. He is an alumnus of both UM and the University of Florida. And we are so glad to welcome back Miriam Marquez, the executive editor of El Nuevo Herald, former editorial page editor of the Miami Herald. Miriam, great to have you back. Rafael, HT. So, HT, let me begin by asking, as you listened to that speech on Friday from President Trump, was there anything there that you said, yes, that's my president, or you know, what was your reaction?
Well, first of all, obviously it sounded a lot like what we had heard in the campaign. But I like the part where he said, from this day forward, power will be transferred from the politicians in Washington to the people. And the next day, the people said, thank you very much for telling us that, Mr. Trump. And we're in the streets all over America resisting any efforts at bigotry, and racism, and xenophobia, resisting any efforts to take health care away from the people, resisting climate deniers. We will do just what you said, and we will take the power that you say is rightfully ours.
Right. It was democracy in action this weekend. Here we have Friday, the presidential swearing in, the inaugural ball, the parades, and then the next day in Washington, 500,000 people, mainly women, and 10,000 in Miami and thousands
all
elsewhere.
Over the place. So
what's that tell you? What's the message?
It depends on what the president sees as the reality at this moment. He took issue yesterday in the middle of all this. His focus was on, you guys got it all wrong. The press got it all wrong at the CIA. He said, you know, this is war with the media. And then later, disturbingly, it was all about this press conference at the White House that was not a press conference, but a statement from his press secretary that said, you guys got it all wrong on the numbers and we're not going to put up with it. And it was based on one guy who did make a mistake, and it was a serious one. But in this world of Twitter and Facebook and posting rapidly, said, oh, the bust of Martin Luther King is not in the Oval Office. Well, that was wrong, and he corrected it pretty quickly.
And apologized.
Apologized. But I think it just started in a weird way for me, you know, looking back at Ronald Reagan and his very inspiring speech.
Yes.
And growing up, you know, I came to this country when Kennedy had just been elected. Wow, you know, this was what a presidency, short but an amazing person. These are hard times, I think, for people who did not support him, but for people who supported him, he is speaking truth to power. He is speaking for them what they feel, you know, they didn't get from previous administration.
Yeah, Rafael Yanez, I read, I thought, a really insightful column from a Washington Post columnist on Saturday where he said, I was crossing the street after the inauguration and a couple in front of me, 50-ish, you know, the husband turned to the wife or the wife to the husband and said, boy, he really showed him, didn't he? And I think that in a way there are, as Miriam says, Trump's supporters, that's what they want.
They like the combativeness, and there's no denying that Trump is taking it to the power establishment in D.C. He's taking it to you, to your profession, to journalists, to both you and Miriam and your colleagues all over the world, not only in the United States. I think it's important to keep in mind this is a classic business strategy. It really shows that Trump is a true businessman and not a politician. Whether you agree or disagree with his strategy, it makes me think of T-Mobile CEO John Legere. He wrote a recent blog post for the Harvard Business Review, and he explained in that blog post that when he came into a failing T-Mobile, he named a villain. That villain was AT&T. And he wasn't afraid to name the villain. He said, you can't just trash talk your rivals, you have to define them, you have to work at them. Trump has been defining his adversaries from day one. Every single event that he has spoken at, he has named Mexicans, Megyn Kelly, he's gone after women at writ large, he's gone after different groups because that created a vacuum in the press and all the attention was narrowed on him.
Well, and HT, on Friday, I thought maybe the most remarkable thing about that whole entire moment of the speech was standing in front of, what, 4 former presidents, the leaders of Congress, and chairmen of the big committees. He essentially said, you have let down the American people, you took care of yourselves while they suffered no more. It's going to end right now.
Right, and I think that was a mistake on his part. I think that it's a good strategy to have a foil, and whether it's the media with 14% approval rating, or whether it's his opponents.
Yeah,
but one of the things we've got to do,
you're almost down to Congress.
We've got to, right. We've got to agree on facts and telling the truth. My concern, I want the president and this country to go forward and to succeed. But do I believe the Donald Trump who says the CIA acts like Nazis, or the Donald Trump that says I'm 1,000% supporter of the CIA? Yeah. I'm just saying. So whatever narrative you want to go with, but don't tell me 2 different things about the exact same thing, because it's confusing.
And Raphael, that frankly, it seems to me, is a huge problem, especially for journalists, because Kellyanne Conway, I think last week during an interview when this disparity between things that he says and does had occurred again, she essentially said, oh, you can't listen to his words literally. You have to understand his heart and what he means. Well, I'm sorry, but words matter. And we, I think, as journalists, if the President of the United States says some words like, I'm going to get rid of wet foot, dry foot, or whatever, I'm going to end the Iran nuclear deal, that matters.
I agree. And it's important to, this is more nuanced than we have ever seen the beginning of an administration. You know, I would like to compare it to when words matter. When President Obama gives phenomenal orations, when he gave his inaugural address, he said, if you unclench your fists, we'll shake your hand, we're willing to work with you. And Trump, and so Obama's first major foreign policy speech was in Cairo, and he talked about America's not at war with Islam. And Trump in his inaugural said, we're going to destroy, eradicate radical Islam. So it's a difference between night and day, and it goes back to these words in Kellyanne Conway's statement that you can't take him literally. I think we're going to have to grow as a country to understand the nuance of Donald Trump and understand when he says something on Twitter versus what he says in the media versus what he tells Congress. It's important to try to melt these together and find out where is the access, where is he spinning from?
We're all going to be working on that. Miriam, it seems to me that one of the other major themes of that speech clearly was this ultra-nationalism. It's going to be only America first. Right. I am not especially a student of American history, but back in the late 1930s, while Europe wanted America to get into World War II, there was a group led by Charles Lindbergh and a Father Coughlin, among others, who called themselves America First. They were anti-Semitic. They could get pretty nasty. I'm not making an invidious comparison here between, you know, the anti-Semitism. I don't think Trump is an anti-Semite.
His favorite son-in-law is Jewish.
Is Orthodox.
I mean,
his daughter converted.
Yeah,
and his daughter converted.
Right,
so
right. But this phrase, America First, this isolationism, where does that go?
I think he's got his own model of America First, and some of his people have talked about that he's not referring to pulling back in all sectors. He's been very strong on the military as far as getting in and righting the ship when it comes to radical Islam. He has been at least adopting radical in the name, because I think sometimes he would slip and not do that, and that hurts a lot of, you know, the majority of folks who practice Islam are not terrorists, and when you look at more than 1 billion people in the world who have that religion, you have to put that in the context. But yes, radical Islam. So I think part of when he says all these things, it gives him a bit of deniability, right? He can say, well, I didn't say that because he later said something else that kind of denied what he had previously said.
But we have to look at what he does too.
And we have to.
So America first, but not for making my ties. America first, but not for building my buildings. I'm going to Poland. and get cheaper workers. And if they give me any problems at all, I'm going to kick them out of the country. So what he says,
or his serving staff at Mar-a-Lago,
right,
that were brought in from abroad and are subject to different kinds of
But that was Trump
conditions.
the businessman. Now we have Trump the president.
All right.
I think
well,
that's
we're
important
all
to keep in
watching
mind.
to see what he does. Hold your thoughts, all. We are going to take a break. We'll be back with more Roundtable in just a minute. We are in the midst of another robust roundtable with Miriam Marquez from El Nuevo Herald, Rafael Yaniz, and the one and only H.T. Smith. Miriam, let's talk just briefly, if we can, about the future of the Affordable Care Act. Last figure I saw, 1.6 million Floridians have signed up now for health coverage under the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And for all its shortcomings, they don't want to lose that coverage.
No, and in fact, Hialeah is like the zip code that has the most per capita Obamacare users. So yes, that is an issue, a big issue for the administration. Two things that have been pretty clear to me in the last few weeks and months. They really like the fact that you can no longer discriminate on pre-existing conditions, and that children of folks who have insurance can go up to age 26. These were wildly popular. That was the first phase of Obamacare that came in. I think where the trouble is that most of Obamacare today, the way it was handed down because of the Supreme Court ruling, the states can decide whether to accept Medicaid or not. And the big against Obamacare is that so many of its folks who are in Obamacare are really on Medicaid and are really getting the money through the government. They're not putting in a lot of money. So in that sense, if they can try to fix that and bring it broader, great. They're starting to talk about accounts. You know, it was a very Republican idea. It's been floating around for 20 years. Whether the average citizen can understand what that means, you have the power of your money, and they go, well, how much money do I really have? I don't have that much. How am I going to now invest in these accounts? And it's a much higher deductible. If they're complaining about Obamacare now, it's going to be a much higher
the Medicaid,
responsibility.
The Medicaid portion that you're discussing is not Medicaid itself, it's a Medicaid expansion program, and Florida chose not to accept the Medicaid expansion dollars, and that created a gap, the coverage gap between those people who previously were the uninsured, completely uninsured, and now are on Obamacare. But we're not focusing on the economic strife that people who are now on Obamacare are facing when and if they have to meet their deductibles as high as $10,000, and they're going up against this cap. They're going to go bankrupt. If you're living paycheck to paycheck and you're on Obamacare because that's the best insurance that you're able, or the only insurance you're able to get, at least you're working. But when you're paycheck to paycheck, it's going to ruin you. And then who picks up the tab at the back end?
Well, right now we have 22 million Americans who have health care. In addition to what Miriam said, also the preventative tests that you can take. Cancer screenings for breast cancer, for cervical cancer, for HIV, for children with autism and things like this, with no cost whatsoever. This, in my judgment, will be the Republican Party's grenade.
Make or break moment.
It's going to be a grenade. When I was in Vietnam, we would find these holes. Instead of go down in the holes because we knew the enemy was there, we'd pull the plug and throw the grenade down. Every now and then, someone would pull the plug and drop the grenade. Therefore, we'd get killed. They're going to pull the plug, which is repeal, and there will not be a replace unless the only way it'll work is that you have either one, you have mandatory coverage, right? Or
the
two,
individual mandate,
or two, you have a single payer, and you know not going to go with that. Remember now, this all started with Republicans.
Well,
this is a Republican idea.
And meanwhile, the president is saying everyone's going to have insurance. How that happens, we will find out.
Universal access.
Well,
universal care is one thing. Access. We all have universal access to wealth.
But not everybody has wealth.
It's a unicorn.
We understand. Miriam, before we run out of time, I need your expertise. I think we all need your expertise on the future of relations with Cuba. I mean, here we have diplomatic relations, we have cruise ships, we have commercial flights, and the end of wet foot, dry foot. What do you see the President Trump doing?
I wish I knew. I think one of the things that he's going to be, he is a businessman, so we have to see whether the cruise ships and all of these things affect his rationale and his thinking about what to do. He brought up a very important point, that 2 years of a closer relationship did not change the human rights issue in Cuba. It worsened it.
Yeah.
It's not the same kind of worsening. It's not 20-year sentences for a lot of these folks. It's grab them, capture them, release them, capture them, release them. It's constant harassment. And incredibly, you know, all of these folks that before, if they would have left the country, these opposition leaders would never have been allowed back. They keep allowing them back in. So I think that's good. That was the one thing that I noticed in the change that really happened before even there was an opening. It's going to be really difficult. We have thousands of Cubans stuck right now in Latin America facing the same thing that Mexicans, Guatemalans, Hondurans, and everyone else who have been trying to get over. But the difference being that if they go back to their country today, they now have no home because they had to sell it to pay for the coyotes to take them over. They have no job, and if they had a state job, that's even worse because they're not going to get that job back. They showed their true colors. They don't want to stay there. What do we do with those folks? And I think, you know, I would hope, and we had an editorial about this, that the Obama presidency, that the White House takes into account those folks and tries to at least help them establish themselves in some third countries or come to us.
We do seem to have a moral obligation to do that. And Raphael, briefly, it seems to me the one element of the Obama policy with Cuba that Mr. Trump could reverse easily is the Cuban medical parole program.
Correct.
Where all these doctors, nurses in third world nations can go to a U.S. consulate or embassy and ask for asylum and get it, be guaranteed. I mean, the Cuban government went crazy and said that's got to end.
Right.
But
the Cuban government viewed that as stealing intellectual capital. But these doctors were sent to these third-party countries, such as Brazil and such as Venezuela, as indentured servants or almost slaves. Because in Venezuela, they're being traded for oil, and Brazil was trading them for debt forgiveness.
I'm going to have to interrupt you. I beg your pardon. But gentlemen and lady, we really appreciate it. An excellent roundtable. Come back again.
Thank you.
All right, after the break, watching the inauguration with the next generation, I sat down with Coral Gables High School students on Friday as they watched the 45th president be sworn in. On Friday, I had the pleasure of watching the inauguration with some students at Coral Gables High School, 16, 17-year-olds who are in an advanced placement American history class. Bright kids, incredibly well-informed and opinionated.
I, Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear.
They're too young to vote, not too young to have strong opinions.
I don't believe what he says. He's a liar, and I don't want Obama's legacy to be ruined by this man.
And I'm glad he's our president. He's going to do very well.
These juniors at Gables High watched intently as Donald Trump was sworn in today. Some liked what they heard.
What I liked about the speech is that instead of making it totally about himself, he was saying, oh, it's about you guys, all the people there.
January 20th, 2017 will be remembered as the day the people became the rulers of this nation again.
There was deep skepticism in this classroom about Trump's populist message. Was there anything that you heard Mr. Trump say that gave you some optimism?
Absolutely not. He claims that opening your heart to patriotism is going to get rid of this prejudice. The prejudice exists in the first place because you believe that there's people who shouldn't be here.
Our country is politically divided, so it shouldn't come as a surprise that this class of students at Coral Gables High, they're divided too.
He disapproves of many people, and I don't think he's going to make us any more, I don't think he's going to bring us together anymore.
But their teacher remains optimistic.
We do have diverse opinions. Most important thing, though, is the peaceful transition of power.
As high school juniors, none of those young people could vote in the presidential race last year. They say they can't wait to vote next time. All right, still to come, my personal perspective on the uncharted political waters we have entered and why I don't think the boat is going to sink.
Here is a live look now from our Fort Lauderdale cam, and here is Weather Authority meteorologist Jennifer Correa with your Sunday forecast. Jennifer.
Good afternoon, South Florida. Winds have been increasing rapidly throughout the morning and now into the afternoon. So wind advisory is now in effect. This is actually going to remain in effect till at least this evening around 7 p.m. Now, this is all out ahead of a cold front that's coming our way by late tonight. But before then, severe storms already popping up across parts of the southeast, including in Georgia and down into the Panhandle along the Gulf Coast. Tornado watches are being issued due to the fact that this system is very strong, and already some severe thunderstorms are popping up. For us in South Florida, the front arrives 1 a.m. tonight. We're going to be sleeping by then, but we have to stay alert because it's a squall line of severe storms, very thin line. It will last till at least 4 a.m., starts to clear out by 5 a.m. And these severe storms could definitely produce some isolated tornadoes and damaging wind gusts. Then cooler conditions will return after the front.
Jennifer, thanks. All right, before we leave you this morning, a personal perspective about the Trump era. It's making a lot of people nervous, a good deal of high anxiety, and frankly, I share that feeling, especially when a newly sworn-in president on his first day in office starts grousing over how the media misreported the size of the crowd at his inauguration. Really, doesn't President Trump have more serious things to worry about? His inaugural speech was consistent with his campaign. In fact, it sounded like a campaign speech, amped up for the occasion. He said he basically thinks the country is in terrible shape in every important way and only he can fix it, which is the same thing he said at the GOP convention, quote, "Only I can fix it." I find that the kind of egregious, sick narcissism that is very troubling. Yes, presidents can and do fix the nation's problems, but they do so with the help of the people and the Congress. And that's what puts my mind at ease a little bit. President Trump cannot succeed without Congress. He shouldn't count on their unwavering support. He is about to unleash a flurry of policy proposals that need the approval of Congress. Things like term limits, renegotiating the North America Free Trade Agreement, overhauling the tax code, shutting off federal money to sanctuary cities, moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, much, much more. A few of these ideas have merit. Others are half-baked. A few never even got close to the oven. That is where Congress comes in. 535 men, women, also who have strong personalities and agendas of their own. True, the majority are Republican, but that is not a guarantee of support for every one of President Trump's proposals. I worked in Washington for several years and know that the chairman of the key congressional committees, they like to exercise their power. They worked long and hard to get it, and they are used to giving orders, not taking them. If Congress can find its spine, the future of the republic will be assured, and that's also true of the judiciary. Our courts are not going away, and they will be a force to counterbalance President Trump's most outrageous and unconstitutional urges. We're talking, yes, about checks and balances. That is how our system works. I'm confident it will work well enough in the Trump era. After all, he's the president, not the king. That is my perspective for this week. I want to pay my respects to the late Edwin Pope, the great sports writer for the Miami Herald. He died this week at 88, a phenomenal sports writer, one of the best ever, and a good friend. We will miss Ed Pope. Hope you have a wonderful Sunday. Remember, as always, stay informed, get involved. What do you think? We invite you to weigh in on any topic you like. You can do it by email, Facebook, Twitter, at any one of these addresses. We're easy to find, and we will write you back.